My dear Professor Fernando Kасал Бертоа, I'm already with you. I have joined the very class.
Yes, finally.
Yeah, finally, yes, I fixed it. It's something like that. So, my dear students, have you joined everybody or not? We are still waiting for the search. Oh, we have the students of the third year study. So, for those, sorry if you do not see me well, otherwise I will switch on the light over here. So, my dear students, let me introduce a good friend of mine, actually. Yes, a well-known expert for political party system, yes, in contrastive typology, Dr. Fernando Kасал Bертоa. And he is an associate professor working at the Ноттінгем University. So, I'm very pleased that he has finally agreed, yes, to find his time and to have this short meeting with us dwelling on the very crisis of democracy, stating it over with that political system reforms taking place in Europe and in the world recently. So we're here. So say hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
They're a bit shy, but let's hope that later they make questions.
Oh, they know that they should, actually. So, what would we do? So let me see whom do I have over here. Almost everybody has joined. And actually we have that very camera bracket over here just for everybody. Because I will later check their knowledge. It's not just for Dr. Kасал Бертоа to blah, 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 blah. Yes, I'm using my students. It's actually, I will check all that knowledge that they will gain for today, actually. Over here. Oh, I have the light. Let me be a little bit bright over here. So finally, we may say that we've met for 2 years over there, not in personally, but using these technologies, international, yes, internet technologies over there, yes, to provide a communication more closer over here. So on that very crisis, let us wait a little bit more. So whom do I have over there? So, yes. Oh, Ala Borisovna, would you also show yourself over here? And everybody, please, I ask you just to switch on the video, yes? Just not to have the still pics, because it's not very comfortable, yes, to have this conversation with, I don't know, Donald McDuck or something like that over here, or a kitten running over there. So, a good friend of mine, would you please start with spending your time with us over here? Oh.
Yes, of course, no problem at all. So I will try to enlighten you for a while, not just blah, blah, blah. And then the blah, blah, blah will be for you. So I'm going to treat you perhaps as guinea pigs. What you're going to see is part of my, new book on the crisis of democracy. So I hope to get lots of wonderful, ideas from you that I can later use and expand in the book. So let me share my screen, if that's okay. And then we start from there, okay?
Yeah.
Good. So let me.
Yeah, we do see it.
Yes, perfect. Let me go to slideshow. Okay, so what are we going to talk today? Well, a bit of everything. What's going on in the world, and especially in Europe. I think, much of the things that I'm going to say, could be applied to Ukraine, right? So basically, what you have been seeing in later, these last, years, the last decade and a half, perhaps we could say 2 decades, is that, democracy is being challenged. If you think of, the main fine, dimensions of democracy, which could be considered, according to Wolfgang Merkel, a great German political science, political rights, government, effective power, horizontal responsibility, civil rights, and, elections, electoral regime, we see that there have been different phenomena that have been challenging these different dimensions. We have, of course, some phenomena that have been going on for a while. We see globalization, who puts into question, the main notion of sovereignty. We see Europeanization and the importance, for example, of parliaments, national parliaments that are members of the European Union. Of course, since 2008 and the Great Recession, we'll be talking more about it later on. We see, a challenge to the notion of political rights, right? Are parties, in decline? How is representation, taking place? Of course, the Syrian migrant crisis, right? The immigration crisis, puts into question the idea of the minorities. Should they be protected? How they should be respected, And of course, and you guys know more about this than anyone else, elections lately have also been challenged because Russia has been meddling everywhere, right? From the presidential elections that got Trump elected, to the Brexit, Catalonia referendum, or so-called referendum of independence, so you can see clearly that, all the 5 dimensions of democracy are being challenged. Of course, this has led, to this idea, right, that political parties and democracy are not good anymore because, they are not, serving people. They are not really, defending the interests of the people, and anti-partisan feelings have been, increasing over time. There is this idea that experts, what we need is real experts. We don't need politicians, because the experts are the ones that really know about, the problems that we are facing. Coronavirus, let's have, the best, doctors in the world, but, not politicians. They know nothing about the coronavirus, right? And of course, this has led to a decrease in the trust of political parties. If you think of, the EU, of course, here is Britain is still concluded. It was the barometer, I think, 2019. You see that around 17% on average of European citizens trust political parties. In some, places like Poland, Portugal, my own country, Spain, or even France, the level of support, reaches 10% at the highest, right? But, the problem is not just, that political parties, are not trusted. The problem is that, all representative, institutions, from political parties to parliament to government, are being less trusted than other not accountable, not representative institutions. People trusting the army and the police, which are neither representative nor accountable, much, much more, as you can see, than in political parties, parliament, and government. Of course, there is also this idea that, political parties are corrupt, that, they are, representing just the establishment. When you look, for example, at the countries that were surveyed by, Transparency International in 2013, you see that 51 of the 107 countries that were surveyed, political parties are considered to be the most corrupt institutions, most corrupt than, justice, police, health system, media. And this is something that, you can see all over the board, United Kingdom, Sweden, United States, Canada, Australia, Brazil, all over the world, India, Korea, and Japan. So we clearly have this idea that something is wrong with democracy because, what is at the core of this democracy, political parties, are, clearly in crisis. And of course, as you can imagine, this leads, to people to vote for parties that are anti-democratic, that are anti-establishment, that are against this idea of liberal representative democracy. What you see here is a graph from a new book that was published, a couple of months ago with Oxford University Press, where that looks at the percentage of support for anti-establishment parties. Anti-establishment parties, think of extreme parties, anti-systemic parties, populist parties, fascist parties, communist parties. These are examples of anti-establishment parties, right? And you see that, since the beginning of the 20th century, it has never been as high as it is, in the last now in the last decade, to the point that 1/5 of the population, on average, again and again, votes for this type of anti-democratic parties. You see it in terms of regions that, there has been a high level of, support, and increase in the level of support for these parties, in, Eastern Europe, in Western Europe. You see, we have since the 1920s, even higher percentage of support for this type of parties than in the interwar period. And of course, in Southern Europe, which, as you know well, have been the most affected by the Great Recession, right? When we look at, different, countries in the world, when we look at the West and South Europe, we see that with very few exceptions, Switzerland perhaps, but, nothing happens ever in Switzerland, there has been an increase in support for this type of parties. The party systems are polarized, I mean, it is difficult to find, this moderation that was the characteristic of, party systems and political parties before, the end of the Cold War. You see it in the East. Think, for example, of Czechia. We have, elections yesterday. The far right got 10%. Babis, got, 27%. The communists who got out of the parliament for the first time since the 1990s, around 5%. You think of Hungary, Orban. You think of Poland, Kaczynski. You clearly see the support for these illiberal democratic parties. And of course, this puts into question, is, this a menace for democracy? Is populism a cancer, like have, some academics, journalists, and practitioners have mentioned? Is really going to put into question democracy to the point that, it might lead to the collapse of democracy? And, in an article that, I published in Representation a couple of years ago using my, data set, that you can find at whogoverns.eu, and has a lot of information about different governments in Europe, including Ukraine, the parties and the party systems in these countries, and goes as far as the Second French Republic in 1848. What you see here is that support for anti-establishment parties has a negative effect. For those who are not, I'm sure you are not familiar with this type of statistical models, I will try to explain you a bit. So what you see here is a horizontal, vertical line, right? When the horizontal lines touch the vertical line, this means that a variable, a factor, is not important. It's not causing, the outcome, which in this case is the quality of democracy. When, on the other hand, the horizontal line does not touch the vertical line, this means that it has an effect. If it's on the left side of the vertical line, it's a negative effect. If it's on the positive line, it's a positive effect. So this is a statistical analysis lesson that I'm giving you briefly today. So what you see here is that, the variable that is marked in red, which means level of support for anti-establishment parties, which, as I mentioned before, it is here measuring the level of polarization, does not touches the vertical line and is on the left side. This means that it has a negative effect. That doesn't mean that the higher the level of support for anti-establishment parties, the lower the level of democracy, the lower the quality of democracy. And no matter the model that we look at, I'm not going to go into that, too much fancy statistics for today are finished, we see that, clearly in those countries where support for anti-establishment parties is high, the quality of democracy is very low. You see it perfectly here, the negative effect. It doesn't matter if we look at Western Europe, it doesn't matter if we look at post-communist Europe, the negative effect is clear. When in countries people decide to vote for this type of parties, the quality of democracy decreases. No matter the dimension of democracy even we look at, there are different dimensions. I'm sure you know about Dahl and the polyarchy concept, about the idea that a democracy is not about elections, it's about respect for human rights, participation, deliberation, equality. No matter which type of dimension we look, it is very clear. You don't need to know a lot about the statistics. The effect is negative, meaning once again that no matter the dimension of democracy we look at, in those countries where populist parties, communist parties, fascist parties, systemic parties are popular, the level of democracy is low. So think, of course, in Ukrainian terms, and try to see how the level of support for, this type of parties and populist parties have increased or not over time. And of course, the quality of democracy that you can observe in your country. So once we know that, yes, anti-political establishment parties, populist parties are a menace for democracy, I thought, well, I need to think why is the case, right? So only by knowing why, I can try to remedy him. I can try, to find a solution to this, right? So let's try to examine which type of, factors have led people to support for this type of parties. It has given place to the rise of anti-establishment parties. And here, which is based on another paper that I published, a couple of years ago on European Political Studies Review, tries to look at basically four factors that scholars, academics have thought, are important for, increasing the support of establishment parties and increasing polarization. The first one, I think, is rather straightforward, and you would agree with me that, it's about economy, according to some scholars. It's about the fact that, of course, when people don't have money, when they have their pockets empty, what do? They vote for those that, offer simple solutions to complex questions. And who they are? Surprise, surprise, the populists, right? So, of course, when democracy is not going well, when economy is not going well, then people tend to turn to these alternative, parties, which, support, as I said, this type of very simplistic, solutions in the short term. But we will see a bit about this later on. Others, like my former, supervisor, the late Peter Mayer, think that the problem is with parties. Traditional political parties are the ones that should be blamed. Because, when you think of parties, when you think about how parties have changed, you see that, they have stopped mobilizing. There is a huge gap between voters and parties. There has been a mutual withdrawal, as he says, from the electoral arena. There is idea that, political parties do not represent the interests of the people anymore. Remember what I was telling at the beginning? But they have become what Ingrid van Bissen has called public utilities. So basically what they have become is representatives of the state rather than, a representative of the people. And because, voters are not stupid, they got tired of these traditional parties and look for new alternative solutions, which, as we have told, are offered by these populist anti-establishment parties. Others, like the American school, Russell Dalton, for example, thinks that it's a question of the society. The society has changed. Think about yourselves and think about your parents, how you think totally different, how you use different technologies. This lecture that I'm giving today would not be possible, 20 years ago. So the same has happened in terms of the values. The values have changed. The class cleavage, this idea that, the world owners of the enterprise and the workers, religion, the role of religion is not as important as before. In the old times, a Catholic or a Christian Orthodox or a Protestant would vote for a, Christian Democratic Party. Someone who would be an atheist would vote for a socialist party, an anti-clerical party. Nowadays, the frontiers are more blurred, right? And because the main cleavages, the main, points of, connection between society and parties are gone, this, of course, raises new issues, new problems that are represented by these new populist parties. Simply, society has changed, therefore, new parties have appeared, which have, unfortunately, this illiberal component. And then, of course, is the economic crisis. And this is a bit different argument than the previous one. It's about, this huge crisis that has happened in 2008. It's about, the not only economic and financial crisis, it's a crisis of values, it's a crisis of society, it's a crisis of politics, right? And therefore, it is after 2008 that things had become worse. So using, now how to interpret, this type of graphs, and you see here on the right-hand side, what we call the full model, you see that, the dot of the economic growth touches the vertical line. So when you look at the causes of support for anti-establishment party, you see that, economy, at least economic development, GDP growth, as measured here, is not affecting, the rise of anti-establishment parties. What is affecting, however, is, what I use here is the crisis of parties, fragmentation. The more fragmented the parties, the more supported, for anti-establishment parties, and, electoral volatility, which is an index famous in political science that simply measures, change in electoral preference. So basically social change. So in this sense, we see that it's the crisis of parties and the change in society that has this effect on the support for anti-establishment parties. So in a way, we can say that both theories, not the economic one, but the one that blames political parties and the one that looks into changes in society, seems to have an impact on the support for anti-establishment parties. And you see it here. You see this positive support. On the left looks at the fragmentation, the crisis of parties. On the right, it looks at electoral change. Both, the more society has changed and there is electoral change, the more fragmented the party system, the more people tend to vote for these political parties. And then you would ask me, yes, and what happened with the Great Recession? What happened with, you were talking about this huge crisis that happened in 2008. That's why, in that same article, we look at a comparison between the Great Depression, which well happened in 1929, in the interwar period, and the Great Recession, which is the one that happened in 2008. What you see here is, once again, marked in red, the dot of the horizontal line touches the vertical line, meaning that the Great Depression, 1929, didn't have an effect on the rise of Nazism, for example, or fascism, because, clearly, there is no impact. The Great Recession is. And how we can interpret this? So basically what we need to think is that there was already a crisis of parties before. There was already a social change. Think of the 70s, the new movement, the May of 1969, things were already changing there, right? And what the Great Recession did was, to push, it was like a spark that made everything exploded. In fact, when you see this graph, on the left-hand side looks at the crisis of parties, on the right-hand side looks at social change, you see that things were already changing before the Great Recession. But it's after the Great Recession, the line with the squares, that, things explode, meaning that, the more political parties are in crisis, the more electoral, change, the higher the support for these anti-establishment parties. So clearly, there is an influence. Let's say that, the Great Recession has been, a kind of moderator. It's the one that, it's like the wire, that brings, the electricity, right, from the source to the TV, right? This is the crisis of, the Great Recession. Things were already going bad, before 2008. The Great Recession has just exponentially, explode all these problems that we had. So what is the main conclusion that you have to take from this? In order to, think of remedies, we see that, well, on the one hand, populist parties, we know that the support of populist parties is a menace for democracy, but thinking a bit in depth about what I have told you and all this analysis that I have presented you, and this is how political scientists, think of, analyzing the big problems of today. Populist parties, at the end of the day, yes, they have a bad influence on democracy, but they are not the main problem of democracy. We saw now that, well, there are basically two main, issues, two main, problems that, affect, the support for establishment parties, and is social change and the crisis of political parties, of traditional political parties. Of course, we as political scientists cannot affect that much the change in society. These are, huge forces, higher forces that, we cannot control. But we can, of course, try to change political parties, try to advise, politicians, try to advise political leaders, and try to see to what extent, by changing their, attitudes, we can help to, we can say, solve the crisis of democracy, the crisis of representative democracy. In other words, populism, anti-establishment, the rise of support for these illiberal parties is just a symptom. The real illness is the crisis of political parties, of traditional political parties. In a way, they are to be blamed. Without the crisis of traditional parties, without this, I told you, withdrawal, between, parties and voters, of which political parties are to be blamed, populist parties would have not appeared. Not even after the, Great Recession. You saw there was already the problem. The problem was already there. The Great Recession was just simply multiplying, the problem. If the problem would not be there, the populist parties will not be nowadays, right? So what we do, how can we change things, right? So if traditional political parties are the problem and populist parties are only the symptom, well, let's see how we treat them. Think of yourselves as surgeons that you have to, operate in the political system, right? Think of yourself as, think of, for example, of populist parties as tumors of a bigger illness, which is the cancer that representative democracy has, right? So what do you do when you have cancer? There are basically 4 remedies for cancer, okay? So the first one, of course, is to extirpate the tumors, right? You do a surgery. What could be, in political science, in party politics studies, extirpation? Well, the prohibition of populist parties. You prohibit populist parties. You ban populist parties. You Ukrainians know a bit about this. 2015, there were, various communist parties that were banned, right? So, this is something that is not new for Ukraine, for example, right? To ban extreme parties. Well, here we have some issues. The first issue is, should democracy ban parties? Because it's democratic to prohibit a political party. So it's a moral issue, How can a democracy be called democracy if it does not allow everybody to express themselves? It defends itself, right? On the other, at the end of the day, one would say, well, shouldn't democracy defend itself? Because if not, look what happened, in Germany in the interwar period, or, in Italy. If those parties had been banned, perhaps we would have avoided the Second World War, right? Then there is also the legal issue, right? It is legal to ban, political parties. The Council of Europe, the European Court of Human Rights, to be more exact, considers that, parties shouldn't be banned except as a last measure. So when everything else has failed, then it is right to or legal to ban political parties. But, when you have tried everything and you see that, those parties are going to kill democracy, then you have the opportunity to ban those parties. Is popular banning parties? Well, yes, it's very popular. In an article that was published by a colleague of mine last year, when they look at, how popular are among European citizens the banning of political parties, this is extremely popular. But even being popular, like with the prohibition in the 20s, it has to end at some point. So the problem with banning is that, you have to keep the banning all the time, because if you leave the ban, then it will not work. And public opinion may change. So, there will be a moment that you will be pressured to leave the ban. And this, of course, creates problems on the utility. Is really useful, the usefulness of, prohibiting parties. When you look at historical, instances, I like a lot to look at the past to learn about the future. So when I think, for example, in Germany in the 1950s, when the Communist Party and the neo-Nazi party were banned, well, it really worked. if you think of, Germany after the Second World War, it was a rather moderate party system with the socialists on the left, the Christian Democrats on the right, the liberals in the center, alternating in government. When you think of Lithuania and how they banned, Finland and how they banned the Lapua movement, and how Finland was one of the Eastern European, democracies that managed, to survive. We see cases, however, where things didn't work. There is no country in Europe that has banned more than Turkey. Turkey has banned more than 15 parties since the end of the Second World War. We have Erdogan. Has banning really worked? Well, perhaps we should have banned AKP in 2002, but the public opinion at the time was not for banning AKP. Think of my country and Harry Batasuna, the political arm of the terrorist movement, ETA. Clear example that, when it was banned, it worked, but public opinion changed. A new prime minister came into government, lifted the ban, and the same problems appear. So we see that there are cases where things work and when things don't work. When we do a quantitative analysis, you see that there is not effect, or there is even a negative effect, meaning that, think of Ukraine, the more you ban these parties, the more people support other type of anti-establishment parties. So clearly, it has not worked as we wanted. The second remedy of cancer is chemotherapy, right? So what is the chemotherapy in our case? Well, is the French call it cordon sanitaire, is the discrimination of this type of parties. Let's don't talk to them. Let's don't even make that like if they exist. Let's don't have pacts with them. There are some issues with this discriminative cordon sanitaire tactic. You need to keep it over time, because like with banning, if you leave it even for one election, it's not useful. You need to keep it not just at the national level, also at the regional level and at the local level, which makes things very complicated, right? Because sometimes the leader of this extreme party in your city is someone who went with you at the school, and that the guy is not a bad person, but the problem are his ideas, right? But if you need his support to become a mayor, well, at the end of the day, there are personal connections. Why not? And this, of course, has implications, because if it's why not there, it's why not in another place. Also, there is this idea that discriminating them reinforces their how can I say, their ideas. This idea that they are the outsider, that they're really fighting against the establishment, and they become martyrs. And what happens with martyrs? They become popular, and people start to vote in them just for this martyrdom effect. If you think of cases of success in Czechoslovakia in the interwar period, the famous Penka 5 center parties were, containing on the left side the communists, on the right side the pro-German, pro-Nazi Germany parties. It was the only democracy in Eastern Europe that survived, unfortunately, until Hitler decided to invade the country. Of course, think of Italy, and the famous partitocrazia of the so-called First Republic. The communists on the left, the neo-fascists on the right, but democracy managed to consolidate. Think of the Front National. They have been, the cordon sanitaire has been used with the Front National, and Le Pen, almost wins the elections against Macron. Think of Belgium, a similar thing, right? So you see, once again, cases where it works and it doesn't. The third, treatment would be hormone therapy, okay? So the hormone therapy here is like reconciliation, Let's adopt some of their ideas. Think of the Conservative Party bringing Brexit in when it was an issue of UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, Farage Party. Think of Spain when we have now a coalition government between the socialists and the communists and the populist radical left. Is the idea that if you can beat them, join them. The problem is that, in some cases it has worked, like in Canada, meaning they became more moderate. In others, like in my own country, it has shown that, they are the same, rubbish and, as the other parties, right? So you have, once again, cases where it works, where it doesn't. Think of, Italy and even Ukraine, when Svoboda was incorporated into the government and later they disappeared, some cases where it worked, other where it didn't. Think of La Lega in Italy or Kaczynski in Poland. So you see, once again, not very clear, if this strategy can work. And the final, remedy is regeneration. As a vegetarian myself, I believe in this idea that, we are what we eat, and if we eat healthy, we are able to fight, cancer, from a, let's say, medical point of view, is what they call stem cell therapy. What it would be? Well, it's the idea that, political parties, traditional political parties, have to regenerate. They have to change. They have to bring back the trust from, society. They have to bring back and shorten this distance with voters. They have to engage, in a dialogue, a sincere dialogue with the voters. So it's about, making political parties stronger, institutionalizing political, making them have strong organizations. It's about, them, trying to get results, trying to really be, responsible. It's about the idea that, they cannot lie. They cannot say that they're going to decrease taxes and, after they win elections, raise the taxes. It's about, becoming transparent. Political parties need to become transparent. You see, in a paper that I published, a couple of months ago in Party Politics, I look at the importance of public finance, right? Because, with public finance, you also get, more transparent measures. Look where Ukraine stands, is the UA, right? So the level of support for anti-establishment parties is very high because, you haven't had public finance. It was not introduced until, a couple of years ago, 2015. And even later, when this new president came, he, got rid of the finance for non-parliamentary parties. So only very big parties could get, this finance. This, of course, is not the way, in my view, to really achieve this transparency. Because if you don't get public money, how you can ask a political party to be transparent? No, you have to give the party resources to hire, professionals, accountants, to get the books in order. If you don't give them public funding, there is no incentive, for, becoming transparent. They need to lead by example, okay? Look, for example, the Conservative Party in Austria. Why it has managed to, survive for so long and is not in crisis as many other, conservative parties? Well, look what Kurz just did 2 days ago. There was a case of corruption involving him. He resigned. This is a way to lead by example, and not like, for example, think of Argentina. The president, Argentina had one of the worst lockdowns in, the history of the coronavirus. And, the president was celebrating his wife's birthday without masks, without social distancing. How you can ask this population, the citizens, to be, responsible if you don't lead by example? Politicians, political parties need to lead by example. They have to think in long-term perspective and not only in the next, poll, in the next, election. They need to, arrive to compromises in countries where, for example, basic policies like migration, pensions, education are changing every time that a new government comes in. I'm not even going to talk about Ukraine, where you change the electoral system and everything every time you have an election, which is the worst thing you can do because institutions need time to have effects. Of course, it's normal that, populist parties, appear and attract the power of electoral support from the people. And of course, traditional political parties, which unfortunately, a lot of them, you would be surprised, have forgotten about it, should think that democracy is not a zero-sum game. In democracy, you win today and you lose tomorrow, but with the possibility to win the day after tomorrow. It's not about the populist understanding that, democracy is just about we who represent the people and the others, out, right? So it's about this, having new political culture, recovering this political culture about this compromise. So I'm finishing now with my talk, but I just want to a bit summarize briefly, what we have been looking at. So, we were talking about, cancer, right? And, there are five stages of grief that clearly summarize the way people tend to react when they go to the doctor and the doctor tells them that, they have cancer. There is a first, reaction, which is denial. Denial of, the populist, symptom is to ban political parties, which I clearly show you that banning populist parties is not the solution. The second thing a cancer patient gets is this stage of anger. It gets angry at why me, This is, the cordon sanitaire. You get angry with someone, you don't talk to them, so you discriminate them. We saw that it does not really work. Sometimes yes, sometimes not. It's not a medicine for everything. Of course, the third stage is bargaining. Let's, talk to them. If you cannot beat them, join them. Remember, we saw that sometimes it works, sometimes not. We are now, in my view, in this fourth stage, the pressure, Oh my God, everything is wrong. These parties are going to take over all, Europe. I think that, we need to get to the acceptance stage. We need to accept that populist parties need to exist, that, populist parties represent, certain part of the population, that populist parties can be an opportunity for traditional political parties to change. If, as I said, I like history, if we take a lesson from history and from the Cold War, we see that confrontation, which is this banning of political parties, with Truman, didn't work. The containment doctrine of Eisenhower, which would be this cordon sanitaire, didn't work neither. Not even the Nixon's detent, and this join them if you cannot beat them. It was, the rollback of the great cowboy, Ronald Reagan, the confrontation, the faces of, let's accept the Soviet Union existence and let's beat them at what they do best, the Star Wars program. This is what really defeated the Soviet Union. And this is why, in my view, can defeat, populist parties. So in conclusion, populist parties, and you have here the leader of the far-right party that yesterday got 10% of the vote in the Czech Republic, are clearly a symptom of the crisis of democracy, which is, traditional political parties. But I think, like Bob the Builder, I'm sure that you know the cartoon, Bob the Builder, political parties are responsible, but they also have a solution. And with a proper management, of which, in my view, the Prime Minister of New Zealand is a great example, but we could also put Trudeau in Canada and some others, you can manage to get your house in order and face the challenge of a the populist and establishment parties. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm really, really happy to hear your questions and ideas. Back to you, Oksana.
Thank you, Dr. Fernando Kastell Bernard. My dear students, would you please raise your questions over here? Just I've asked you also to be all in your ears and listen to and be ready to ask over there. Because yes, in some cases, we do not deal exactly with the political party, but nevertheless, all those processes taking place on this arena actually influence the inner policy and foreign policy as well, actually. And those parties winning then play the violin when implementing their own foreign policy over there. So please, would you raise your questions? Linka?
So, hello to everyone. It's really nice to meet you today, and thank you very much for this exciting speech. And when we talk about like political parties and populism, it's really interesting. If populistic political parties had banned, would they maybe gain more admission and popularism behind and among the population of the European countries, or if we talk about like East countries? So it's really interesting to maybe find out more information about it. It's probable or not?
Okay, Shall I collect or just answer one by one? What do you want? Oksana?
Yeah, you
Yeah.
may do it as you want.
Okay, so let's go one by one. So, I mean, if you think, for example, you know, of the case I know best, right, which is this case that I mentioned about Batasuna, right, which is, I'm sure you have heard about ETA, which is a Basque terrorist movement that killing in Spain, you know, more than 800 people, you know, since basically the late 60s and early 70s. So this party was banned, you know, in 2003 after the government, after more than 800 people were killed, decided to ban the political party, right? And what you got, right, is like 4 or 5 years, a bit more, because it was until 2011 that the Supreme Court decided, you know, to still ban it, but the Constitutional Court lifted the ban, right? Where this party basically disappeared from, you know, the face of the political system in Spain. People who were supporting this party, you know, were wasting their votes, were not, you know, voting for this party. In 2008, as I said, a new prime minister came in, Zapatero, right? And he changed, you know, 2004, and he changed the, you know, the policy. So, you know, he started to negotiate with ETA and things like that. What happened today? Batasuna is the second most important party in the Basque Country. It is supporting the government in Navarra, which is another region of Spain, and it is supporting the government, the national government of Pedro Sánchez. So without Batasuna, Pedro Sánchez would not be prime minister. So what I'm trying today is that, you know, it has helped to, you know, legitimize, right, this political party. So what I'm trying to tell you with this is that, you know, when you ban a political party, you create a martyr. It happened in Turkey as well. When you think of, you know, the Virtu party that later was banned, it created the Felicity party, which was later banned. The third party that came from it was AKP, Erdogan's party. Of course, you know, they had to change. They became like a wolf with the skin of a sheep, right? And this was the excuse not to ban them. But in reality, they were a wolf inside. And clearly, you know, we realize that, you know, Erdogan is the worst of the wolves that we have ever met, at least in Turkey, right? And therefore, you know, if they had banned AKP, we would not have Erdogan nowadays in Turkey, and we would not have a collapse of democracy in Turkey, right? So in this sense, I think that, you know, banning political parties might be useful certain times, but it also can have, you know, a slashback in the sense that, you know, it may create them martyrs and make them, you know, people join them and support them because, you know, they are like, you know, the saviors, you know, who have been crucified, right? Without, of course, the moderate speech of Jesus Christ, right? So clearly you see that. You were mentioning, interesting, you know, your question, you were mentioning Western Europe and Eastern Europe. To be honest, in Eastern Europe, I would say that, you know, perhaps Ukraine is a bit of an exception because Lithuania, Latvia banned the Communist Party in the early 90s. Moldova did it also, but later it allowed to reconstitute in 1994, 1995. In Poland, in the Czech Republic, for example, there has been one ban of a party, but a minor party. It has been a ban also in the Slovakia. So you see, you know, in Eastern Europe, not many parties have been banned, and the ones that have been banned, they were already non-important parties. So for the judges, it was very easy to ban them because, you know, nobody cared about these parties anymore. So things are changing in this sense, and even in Germany, if you think of Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland has not been banned, and the NPD, which is another far-right party, the Constitutional Court decided not to ban them because they are considered not to be dangerous. The problem is, and I was thinking when I was reading that, you know, resolution of the German Constitutional Court, well, if they would be dangerous, you would not be now deciding on this because they would have already taken power. So the question is, should we wait until there is not a remedy? I don't know, it's complicated. In any case, I believe that banning parties is not the solution because, it's not morally correct. It's legally questionable. And in practice, it doesn't work. Or at least it doesn't work all the time. We need to find long-term solutions, not short-term ones. So, but, it's a very good question. Yes, certainly.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Somebody else? Yes, Arsene. Arsene, you may ask your question.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very informative. Well, my question will be related to the American political system. So we all understand, we all realize that in 2024, the Trump's return, or even in 2022 during the midterm elections, the Trump's return is cannot be ruled out, and the United States, as well as the whole world, will have to deal with a thoroughly, let's say, Trumpified Republican Party. And as long as with the Democrats, who half of which are far left now, and they really want to take the agenda in the Congress. So probably my question will sound like this: will it be the main thing that will influence the world's democracy crisis? And if yes, in what percentage, like in your opinion? So, well, that's this one, and probably one more. As for banning political parties, this one will be related to banning politicians, because we know a lot of examples in the Congress. It's like in the context of the United States, but also we can take a look at like the world's context as well. So should we ban some radical politicians, in your opinion? So yeah, thank you.
Okay, I guess you meant, I don't know, 2012, because 2022 we don't have yet, results, yeah, right?
I mean the midterm elections in the United States.
I know, but this is future, I mean,
yeah.
we political scientists are not fortune tellers, right? So, we can, predict what happened in the past, not predict, sorry, explain what happened in the past, but, we cannot predict the future. So that one is a $1 million question, which, given the flag that you have behind you, may be, more knowledgeable than me about that. What I want to say is that, so I don't have an answer to your question, of course, because, to the future, I don't know, right? But what I can say is that two things. The first one is that the current polarization of the United States politics, it builds on, so it has been building over time. If you think about it, Trump is not, but, so the current, division within the Democratic Party, and what you were mentioning properly, Pelosi and Osario and all these, women, which is strange because, women tend to be more moderate than men, right? And this is something that studies have shown again and again. So this, let's say, radicalization of the Democratic Party is not but a reaction towards, Trumpism, which, by the way, it was not but a reaction, against, Obama, and his, more, at least economically leftist, the Obamacare and other, issues, and the peace in the world and all these, these things, so, and Obama was itself a reaction against, the war, fare of Bush. So we can say that, it is being building, over time, right? So this is problematic because, you see that this is becoming systemic. It's not a question of, Trump, or no. This is something that is within, American society. On the other hand, I would say, so the good news is that, America has one of the strongest institutions, in the world. And this is something that is always what I tell, legislators and practitioners and other, scholars. The important thing that we need is to build strong institutions, because, people come and go, right? But institutions remain, right? And this is, for example, in my view, I already mentioned a bit about this in the lecture, but this is the great problem with Ukraine. You have very weak institutions. You have very weak politicians, the Americans as well, but they have strong institutions. You don't. Of course, you know, for that you need time. And then you can tell me, well, we started in 1994 and they started, you know, in 1870 or even before. Yes, you're right. But if you change your institutions every 4 years, there is no way that you will ever, you know, regain time, right? So this is regarding your first question. Regarding your second question, banning politicians is a total different thing, because, you know, you don't need a special law to ban politicians. You just go to the, you know, criminal code. For example, you know, in many countries, you know, hate speech has been, you know, used to ban, you know, certain, you know, politicians, or, you know, the fact that, for example, the other day in Spain, you know, one of the politicians was banned from his seat because, you know, he had kicked, you know, a policeman, for example, you know. So what I'm trying to say is that, you know, banning politicians is easier than, you know, banning political parties, because, you know, I mean, politician is just one individual. There is a clear act and you can ban it. The political party is different because, you know, it's a conglomerate of different, you know, personalities. So in this, what happened in the United States? Well, in the United States, the question is that, you know, I mean, the Constitutional Court, the Supreme Court, sorry, has always, you know, let's say, put its weight on the freedom of speech, right? So there, you know, like in everything, usually in life, you know, you have two goods that you need to, you know, defend and protect, right? So, you know, I'm not against, you know, banning, more than banning, let's say, punishing politicians for certain, you know, issues. For example, if a politician, you know, denies the Holocaust, you know, I think, you know, he should be, you know, punished, because, you know, this is something that, you know, is objectively proven, you know, and it's something that, of course, you know, builds polarization and is hate speech, right? Other issues, as long as you, in my view, and perhaps here I'm being influenced by the doctrine of the Spanish Constitutional Court, but, you know, as long as you defend your ideas in a democratic way, you don't, you know, call for violence, something that, for example, you know, Trump and others were a bit irresponsible. I'm not saying that they were specifically calling for a coup d'etat, but they were ambivalent enough to allow for all these crazy people, you know, to assault, you know, the Capitol, right? So, you know, then there is no problem. And I think that, you know, you don't need special laws for that. I mean, the most criminal codes in the world, you know, criminalize this type of, you know, attitude. So, in other words, you can have the craziest ideas ever. You know, I know in Ukraine what I'm going to say is a bit controversial. So if you want Crimea to succeed, you should defend it. What you cannot do is to go to war to defend it. So if you gain momentum enough to organize a referendum and all the Crimeans want to get to Russia, not to Ukraine, well, this is democratic. The same in Spain. The problem is that, for example, in Catalonia, not 50% of the people, you know, wanted independence. So it was not still a momentum for the referendum. You know what I mean? But if at some point, you know, 60% of Catalans want to succeed, why not? You know what I mean? You change the constitution and you do it. What you cannot do is, like they happened in the 1st of October 2017, you know, you beat the police, you know, you go to vote illegal and things like that. And the same happened in Ukraine with the, you know, invasion of Crimea. This is not conceivable. But if there is a democratic way to, anything could be, you know, in my view, defended in a democratic way. Hope I managed to somehow address your issues.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Arsene, are you satisfied or not?
Yeah, everything was beautiful.
Well, I don't know if it was beautiful, but at least it was logical.
And logical as well. So, somebody else? Хотя плохие knows that you like speaking over here. So, okay, in case that the connection with, so Fernando, I do know that you spent much time looking into the Ukrainian political party system, etc., and you've stated for a couple of times over here. So during your speech, you've mentioned the division into the traditional political parties and populist political parties. When analyzing the current situation on the, may I say, political party system market in Ukraine, how you may characterize our political parties over here? Which one of them may be at least called being the traditional one, paying attention to our 30 years history as an independent state over there?
Well, perhaps the problem is, in Ukraine is that everybody is a populist, but, I don't want to be as controversial as that. But, what I can say is that, sometimes you can have, populist politicians. For example, going back to Arsen's question before, Trump was a populist, but the Republican Party is not a populist party, right? If thinking of the Ukrainian, Ukrainian market, most of the politicians are populists, but this does not mean that their parties are populist. For example, I think that, I don't know, Varavchina, for example, could be considered a traditional party, despite it has a populist leader, and sometimes it has, very nationalistic rhetoric, right? But still, is the only one that is left, almost from the beginning of the consolidation of the party system. Because, if you think about it, it was, founded, in the late 90s. It became really, a force around 2002, right? And later with the Orange Revolution, and it's the only one that stays there. All the others are basically, new parties. Some of them formed very recently, Poroshenko, right? The mayor of Kiev, Klitschko, of course, the teacher who became president. I mean, teacher in fiction, of course. Zelensky. I mean, to be honest, it's a complicated, to classify parties in Ukraine, because perhaps I should classify them all as populist. I mean, let's see. The problem with Ukraine is that the party system has changed so often. So as you know better than me, you have a first period until 2002 where basically they were not really parties. Later you have a consolidation of the party system, right, with the party or regions on the left, and Varavchina and Orange, the Nasha Ukraine, our Ukraine on the right. I would say that those, even if they had some populist politicians, those were traditional parties. The problem is that, with the Euromaidan, everything blew up again, right? And then you have the King Chocolate, coming in, and the actor coming in. So I mean, things are very shaky, very unstable. And if you read my last book, Ukraine is one of the least institutionalized, has one of the least institutionalized party systems in the whole Europe, right? According to some indexes, it's not even a democracy anymore, right? Why? Well, weak institutions, weak political parties, populist, politicians. Wow, I mean, it's like worse than caipirinha, the worst cocktail ever, So no wonder that, things don't go so well in your country. Sorry, guys, but I need to be realistic on this. I'm an academic, unfortunately.
No, it's true. And what do you think it over the opposite platforms for life, опозиційна платформа for життя? Because the whole composition of this party previously was the Party of Regions of Ukraine, being banned after the year 2014 over here. May it consider it to be a traditional one?
Well, I think that, as a party of regions, it could have been a traditional one, but I think that, it has evolved in a, how can I say, perhaps illegitimate opposition. So in a way, there is a clear anti-establishment component. So let me put it this way, and perhaps to clarify also for students. So all populist parties are anti-establishment, but not all anti-establishment parties are populist, right? So in a way, perhaps the opposition, party in Ukraine is clear anti-establishment. It cannot be more anti-establishment because it wants to change the constitutional structure of the country. I mean, this is the essence of being anti-establishment, but not necessarily populist, right? Of course, if it continues with the policies of Yanukovych, which was an illiberal, politician, then yes, we can consider it also a populist. But what I'm trying to say with this, and this is perhaps an interesting lesson for the students, is that you can have populist parties that are anti-establishment, but you can also have anti-establishment parties which are not populist. Okay, and perhaps this is the case in the case of the opposition party, right?
Okay, and the last one, I think, before we wind up over here. So from the very beginning of your speech, you've mentioned that there are some different reasons, yes, or causes for this crisis in democracy, yes, and there are some recent changes, and the very results of the elections held. You have even mentioned Czech Republic, yes. So unexpected results over here, yes, with the winning party. Then a couple of weeks ago, even months or something like that, within a month, you've also provided with your comments on those results of those elections taking place in Germany over here. So how you may characterize briefly what actually was the reason, was the cause, what actually influenced upon such a drastic change of the voters' views. So, because nobody expected, there were too many discussions in advance in case this party would win the result, that one and that one and that one, but the results are shocking. Yes, and actually it influences much Ukraine as well, with Germany being the supporter of Ukraine, and even in those Minsk agreements, yes, actually, and nobody knows what will be the next one. Czech Republic being one of the neighboring countries, yes, and post-socialist country over here. So what actually that is, maybe, I don't know, that very gap and the very reason COVID-19 and the people got tired because of that everything. I don't know, the degrees of, I don't know, I mean, let's say that those people no longer do believe for their leaders, but that degrees in support of the ruling parties. What was that? Maybe.
Well, I mean, the question is that, there are, the question is, there are local reasons, let's say, for example, in the case of the Czech Republic, the management of the COVID crisis also had an important, role, right? I mean, the Czech Republic did do rather bad, in terms of, control of COVID-19. The same in terms of corruption. I mean, Babis is himself, now being investigated, under a corruption scandal. And people got tired of, his, let's say, taking advantage of, his business. He's the richest man, one of the richest men in the country, taking advantage of, government and other things. I know that what I'm saying in Ukraine is just every day happening, right? So for you guys, that these oligarchs come in and take over the state, this is just the normal thing. I understand that. So, I don't want to, but, in the Czech Republic was not. In fact, Czech Republic was one of the most liberal, economically liberal countries, in the whole Eastern Europe. So these things like Babiš are a bit of an abnormality. And thanks God, they got rid of him, and now, there will be a new government. In case of Germany, of course, I mean, Merkel effect, is very important to take into consideration, because at the end of the day, we know that if Merkel would have become, a candidate, CDU would have won and would not have lost as much as they did. In general, I see that, but there are local explanations, okay? But I think that there is one explanation that goes across the board, right? And there has been, and as I show it, electoral change, meaning a generational change. Okay, so society is different than it was, 30, years ago, right? 20 years ago, generation 20 years ago. Okay, the way of communicating, for example, has totally changed. The way, political campaigning is taking place. And political parties have not managed to adapt to these new, changes, right? They still think in the old, let's say, more stable, terms. Society has become, it has changed, and, politics have become more fluid, right? And political parties and politicians have not yet understood, what is going on. To that, you can take it the fact that politicians are less and less prepared. If you think about the old generation of politicians, and you think of Robert Schuman, Adenauer, De Gasperi, Helmut Kohl, Willy Brandt, these people were intellectuals. These people had done many things before coming into politics. They had a lot of experience, right? But when you think, for more, Babiš, let's think about it. Who is Babiš? You know what I mean? He was, he was a communist, by the way, But what I'm trying to say is that, in Spain, for example, the president has a PhD who he plagiarized. The leader of the opposition has a master who he bought. The other one, also. Bought his studies. So these are people that think of, even in the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson. Who is Boris Johnson? What has done Boris Johnson? Except for living out of politics basically all his life. The problem is that what Peter Mann and Richard Kass were talking about, the cartelization of politics, the professionalization. Professionalization is good, but when everything becomes, so the streams are bad, when there are only professionals, people that with 18 years old, they become part of, a political party, and the only thing that they know is, the political party, so the so-called careerists, right? Then, you have, people that don't know anything else. And this, in my view, is problematic. And this is what is happening, in many parties in Ukraine, in many parties, especially in Eastern Europe, where there is this, lack of social rules of political parties. So just to finish the answer, political parties are weaker than ever because they also have the weakest leader that ever have been seen in the history of Europe. And this way is very difficult. That's why, I claim, or I, recommend, a regeneration of political parties, right? So the political parties then can cleanse, and establish, a different mechanism, where you get, meritocracy as an important, for example, way of becoming, part of a political party. When you have political parties that use both, traditional ways and new ways, I think that, social media, for example, is something that has changed. And on the one hand, has a lot of possibilities, but on the other hand, and coming back to the results that you were mentioning before, has done a lot of damage, because Facebook and, Twitter, is incredible how much damage, especially among young people who doesn't watch, young people, the guys that I'm seeing on the screen, I'm sure, they get the news through YouTube and through Netflix. They don't read newspapers. They don't watch TV. I'm not blaming them, it's the way things are done now. But, perhaps it would be good to see, to see the other side of the coin. Every morning when I wake up, I read El País and El Mundo, as you know well, one is center left, the other is center right, in order to try to understand where the truth lies, which is usually in the middle. But, if you get your news from your Facebook, where all your Facebook friends usually think ideologically the same as you will only get one side of the story. You will never change your mind. You will never have critical thinking. And the society and politics will become more and more polarized. This is something that, for example, political parties don't understand, and also voters, because we have been putting the blame on political parties, but here I have all these young voters, all these young future, hopefully, members of political parties, because at the end of the day, guys, you can change anything if you don't join a political party, if you don't get involved. If you really want to change things, you need to work hard. Democracy is a prize. Democracy needs to be conquered. Democracy needs to be defended. Think about it. France started in 1789. 1789. There were civil wars. There were coups. They only really became consolidated, really, with the Fifth Republic, which is basically in the 60s. Think, 200 years of history. Ukraine, it started democratic in 1994. Do you guys want to know? If you only get involved, fight for it, freedom is a prize that you need to earn yourselves. So, it's important, voters are also to be blamed. So this is something that, I try, with my small, pinch of, of sand, to help to get, young people, especially, conscious of their important role in the defense and conquering of democracy.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for the time you shared with us and you spent with us, actually. Thank you for the information you provided us with. So I will say my personal thank to you a little bit later and personally over here. So unfortunately, we should say goodbye over there because students do have the next one class and with me as well. So that's why I will start testing them, yes.
So guys, be patient, be patient.
Yeah, Mr. Best over here, so but not from the point of view of teaching that one. So thank you. And should say bye over here. So,
it was a pleasure. Thank you very much. Anytime.
As well. So
bye-bye.
Stay in touch. I'll call you over there.
Okay.